Well, welcome back, and I think more are still on their way, but we have to get going. There's been a slight change in schedule, and that's why I'm moderating this session rather than the eminent Brad Malkowski, who now, with extraordinary kindness, agreed to deliver a talk instead and had about 5 hours in which to prepare it. Our original presenter, other than Robert Gemello, Robert Trent Pomplin, wonderful scholar, dear friend, had to withdraw for reasons of health. He's all right, but a year ago he did have a kidney transplant, and this occasionally, it's a long recovery process, and occasionally there are setbacks, and he experienced one this week. So he asked me to express his regrets. He really hated pulling out at the last moment, and is very grateful to Brad for picking up the slack for him. My name is David Hart, although the script I have here tells me I'm Brad Malkowski. And I'm a Templeton Fellow this year at the NDIAS, a very grateful one. I would like to express the Institute's great thanks to the John Templeton Foundation. It's due to their generosity and through a grant to the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study that we're able to make possible this Templeton Colloquium at the NDIAS here today. This colloquium was conceived by me, one of this year's Templeton Fellows, and I'm reliably informed by the script here that my goal was to bring together scholars from numerous disciplines and fields to examine critical topics about consciousness, including whether consciousness can evolve and emerge from matter, intentionality, and the transcendental ends of consciousness, classical metaphysics of the soul, Eastern contributions to the understanding of consciousness, and the soul and the whole of being, a tiny, tiny topic there at the end. The intent of Professor Hart was to have our presenters, moderators, and you respond to, comment on, and engage the larger project that I've proposed, but which I'm still working out. First, the session will go as follows. First, Bradley Malkowski and Robert Gemello will present their thoughts on certain Eastern or possible Eastern contributions to the understanding of consciousness. I reserve the right to make the first response if I feel equal to the task. The second part will consist of the larger discussion for everyone here, and this will include time for questions and comments, as well as those for those here, that is, as well as for those watching the session via the NDIAS website and posting questions via email. Our presenters this morning are Bradley Malkowski and Robert Gemello. Brad Malkowski is Associate Professor of Comparative Theology at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on the doctrinal and spiritual relation of Christianity to other religions, especially the Hindu-Christian encounter. He is the author of The Role of Divine Grace and the Soteriology of Shankaracharya. It's funny, I've never mispronounced Shankara's name in my life, but I do it here. Shankaracharya. It's because you used the M rather than the N spelling. I'm sorry. And God's Other Children, Personal Encounters with Love, Holiness, and Faith in Sacred India, which describes his interaction with Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, and won the Houston Smith Prize, and I can tell you personally is a lovely book. He's also the editor of New Perspectives on Advaita Vedanta. His current project compares Hindu and Christian eschatology, focusing on purgatory, reincarnation, and final spiritual liberation. And since 2001, Professor Malkowski has served as editor of the Journal of Hindu-Christian Studies. Robert Gemello is Research Professor of Theology and of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Notre Dame. His work focuses on the history of Buddhism in East Asia, with special interests in the theology of religions, comparative mysticism, and the question of what Catholic theology can or should or must make of Buddhism. He is the author of A Design for Liberation, Risheng's Diagram of the Realm of Truth. Now, there's my lousy Chinese pronunciation coming through as well. Forthcoming, and the co-editor of Studies in Chan and Huayan with Peter Gregory. Paths to Liberation, the Marga and its Transformations in Buddhist Thought, and Avatamsaka Buddhism in East Asia, Origins and Adaptations of a Visual Culture with Frederick Girard and Imre Hamar. The presenters will proceed with their individual presentations, and when they finish, as I said, I'll respond if I feel up to it. And when questions have been exhausted, when time is approaching 12:25, Brad or Don will apparently give me a signal. I'm sorry, that wasn't supposed to be text to be read out. Ava Shankaracharya, you know, and I'm reading the stuff in brackets. So, thanks again, Brad, and I will let you make your presentation.
Thank you.
Does it have a title, by the way?
The title is wrong.
Okay. The title is wrong.
I was putting this together as late as 12 last night, so everything's a bit jumbled up here. And it occurred to me this morning that I ought to add a couple of words, not consciousness in Advaita Vedanta, but consciousness and selfhood in Advaita Vedanta. Now, I was told just very recently that I was asked if I could prepare something in place of Professor Pomplin. And David asked me to reflect on the relationship of jiva, which means something like embodied soul, and Ishvara, which means the Lord, and also the word Atman, which means the self, or the supreme self. Now, I just want to make one brief statement, kind of like letting you know that this is not so easy. That I've always said this about the discourse of the Vedantins in India about the self. I would say this: it is much more difficult to talk about the true nature of the self than it is to talk about the true nature of God. It's very difficult. And there's all kinds of battles that have been fought for 2,000 years about this. But in any case, I'm going to read a little bit here because I only got as far as one paragraph of writing. Other than that, I'm going to be showing slides and then commenting on them, possibly not in the proper order even. Anyway, Advaita Vedanta, which I will explain exactly what it is very quickly, is not a bad choice, not a bad Hindu choice for a conference dealing with consciousness. Since the 19th century, Advaita Vedanta is the school of Hindu thought best known to Western scholars. But Advaita's relevance in the Western academy is, I think, somewhat on the wane today. It's on the decline. Mostly because many people assume it to be irrelevant for contributing anything to the various social liberation movements that now dominate religious discourse. An important exception to this neglect of social liberation by Advaitins is the work of the Hindu scholar Anantanand Rambachan, himself an Advaitin who was here at Notre Dame last September, with his last two books, The Advaita Worldview from 2006 and A Hindu Theology of Liberation from 2015. That book from 2006, The Advaita Worldview, is the best introduction to the intellectual and spiritual connection of Advaita Vedanta that you'll find anywhere in English. Now, for the most part, Advaita Vedanta has been and continues to be focused on interiority and consciousness and a soteriology of enlightenment rather than a soteriology of love or service. And that's one of the reasons why it is less and less popular today, I think, among people in the Western Academy. So let me go on now to start figuring out how to use this properly. Just a little bit of background for those people who don't know what Advaita Vedanta is. I'm hoping that's most of you, because I'm trying to pitch this as low as possible with my very little preparation. But you'll see here after halfway down, you see in bold letters the words Advaita Vedanta, which is what I'm focusing on here today. And you see that in parentheses after that, you see the word Shankara. And I'm going to have to skip around because I don't know how to find this exactly. But this is Shankara. This is based on a photograph taken of him 1,200 years ago. You're supposed to laugh at that joke, by the way. Okay. And The 3 lines across his forehead tells you that he's a worshiper of Shiva instead of Vishnu, but that's wrong. We now know that he probably worshipped Vishnu, but that's totally irrelevant. In any case, this person is very important for being the main spokesperson for what is best in Advaita Vedanta. He's the great thinker, he's the great master of Advaita Vedanta. But where does this Advaita Vedanta come from, and what's the meaning of the words? Well, if you go back a little bit higher on this page, you'll see that there's this word called Vedanta at the title. And Vedanta is a word that designates any number of Hindu schools that take as their primary source of truth Hindu revelation as expressed in the Upanishads. So the Upanishads are dated very roughly between 700 and 200 BCE. So this is when we think the Upanishads were written for the first time. We're not really sure about that. And so from the very beginning, there's been some problems with the message of the Upanishads. And the main concerns have been, in terms of what it wants to teach, is some of the things that I've written here, but I've added to them. I'm going to get out my piece of paper here. Some of the key themes of the Upanishads, as I've listed, is the quest for reality beyond all the appearances. Another way of looking at it is this. The Upanishads will ask the question, this is in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains like 2,500 years ago. What is the truly real? What is its nature? And prior to the articulation of the Upanishads, there was a question that emerged before there was any discussion at all about a possible ultimate reality as the source of the world. The way it was phrased was this: what is that which, when known, all else becomes known? What is that which, when known, all else becomes known? And the answer to that question was the word Brahman. And so that's, I'm not even sure where I have that, but it's there somewhere. So Brahman, well, let me see if I can find this right now so you know how to spell this. Here we go. Brahman, this is a very limited description, actually, that I threw together last night. I left a lot of things out. But Brahman, basically, in many different respects, should be regarded as the supreme reality. It is utterly simple and undivided. It is changeless, limitless, eternal, uncaused. The cause of the world's existence. I'm not just reading aloud here, I'm adding things. It is beyond all human thought and speech. Words are incapable of defining it. We have this expression, neti, neti, not this, not this. No word can really properly describe what it is. Their secondary or analogical meanings can indirectly indicate its essence as reality itself. Plenitude of being, here's the word sat. The word sat means being. It also means ultimate truth. Pure consciousness, chit, and unalloyed bliss, ananda. So these are terms very often used throughout the Hindu tradition, even outside of Vedanta, for the ultimate reality. It is that which must be known as one's innermost identity or essence, Atman, which means self, literally means self. If bondage to ignorance, desire, and fear, I put them in hyphens because we have a compound called raga dvesha that I want to explain in a bit, and delusion are to be overcome. So one of the points I want to make here is this. Yes, we do have this teaching about the ultimate reality, but from the very beginning of the teaching, we find it in the Upanishads and throughout all of the Vedantan schools, the main point is not to come to a proper philosophical or theological understanding of the ultimate for its own sake. The point is you need to recognize the practical value of a proper understanding of the ultimate reality. And so the purpose then of a proper understanding of the ultimate is to understand what its relationship is to you. And the proper understanding of that will open up possibilities as to whether or not you should be meditating or whether or not you should be praying. But in any case, you need to reach a point of awakening to who you really are as opposed to who you think you normally are. I know that's kind of rambling. In any case, then you have the Upanishads. Now, the Upanishads themselves are seen to be revealed scripture. This is not the product of thinking, of human speech, human thought, you see. And so that means that for all the Vedantins, this is the unquestioned starting point of all their reflections on the ultimate reality. What does Scripture teach? So this is what the Upanishads finally are about. The problem with that is that the Upanishads themselves, and these are written by different people over a 700-year period, the Upanishads themselves do not have a unified ontology, okay? And there's a well-known historian of Hindu thought named Dasgupta who said somewhere that there are at least 3 different ontologies that you'll find in the Upanishads. One of them treats the world as if it's an illusion. Another one treats the world as if it's world and God as if they're one. That is a kind of pantheism. And another one has a real theistic understanding of a real creation. And it's because of that ambiguity that you have the emergence of all these different Vedanta schools who want to make sense out of all these different passages of the Upanishads, who has the best understanding of the ultimate reality and its relation to the world. So all the different Vedanta schools, and I've only listed 3 of them here, Advaita Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, and Dvaita Vedanta. These are only 3 out of 10 major schools, but these are the 3 most important schools of Vedanta. In each time, the word that comes before the word Vedanta, whether it's Advaita or Vishishtadvaita or Dvaita, designates what they consider to be the proper understanding of the world's relation to its source, whether it's pantheistic or dualistic or whatever, okay? But the big issue really for all of these different Upanishads, even with their disagreements about the ontological relationship of the world to its cause, the real issue is to get us to recognize that however we understand this presence, there is a presence within of the ultimate reality, which, when perfectly known, brings great joy, peace, and no longer brings about or brings an end to the reincarnation process. So that is going to take me now a little bit into this distinction here, the third one down here. One of the key themes of the Upanishads is the distinction between higher and lower perspectives of knowledge or truth. So the higher one is called the Paramartha Avastha versus the Vyavahara Avastha. That's the difference between what things appear to be, or the way truth appears to be, versus the way things really are. And this becomes important for sorting out issues about what you think yourself to be versus what you really are. Not only in regard to God, but in regard to who you take yourself to be here. So the Upanishads, it's important to recognize as well, the Upanishads want us to become aware of the truth of our own being. What is that ultimate truth? Who are we in our essence? And what they do is sometimes they'll reason their way through different people or different gods discussing the nature of the ultimate reality, but very often they do something different than trying to reason their way to a deeper insight. They will simply proclaim the truth about the true nature of reality and your own true essence. And so what you have then is you have what are called the great sayings. Okay, these are called the Mahavákyas, the great sayings. And so each one of these, whether it's called that you are, Tatvamasi, or I am Brahman, this self is Brahman, or Brahman is the highest wisdom, each one of these is supposed to be a summary in its own way of the entire essence or teaching of the Upanishads. And the most important one is actually the first one. And so Shankara teaches that a person with the proper mindset, a proper openness, proper purification of mind, upon hearing this phrase from a teacher directed to him for the first time, with a proper mind, can attain enlightenment, Tatvamasi. And if they don't get it, then there's this long exegetical process involving meditation as well. But it's really a meditation on scripture where you come to a deeper and deeper and clearer understanding of your true nature. Okay? So basically it's about this hidden unity that we don't normally see, we're not normally aware of. We mistake the many for being absolute. We don't recognize that the many things of the world, according to most understandings of Advaita, the many things of the world, they not only can be seen to express the Creator, and I'm using that word with a little bit of reluctance because there's a debate in Advaita as to whether or not the world's a creation at all. But in any case, at least from the lower perspective of truth and insight, where you're not yet enlightened, you can regard the world in all of its multiplicity as expressing, each in its own way, each of these different forms, something of the beauty and the truth and the goodness of the ultimate reality. But at the same time, that the multiplicity of things express the one, they also obscure it and hide it by virtue of their very multiple nature. So the Upanishads are there to lead us from the many to the one, and not as something that we would arrive at only theoretically, but as an ecstatic experience of recognizing our own true nature, which is in one sense one with the ultimate reality. Some would go so far as to say it is the ultimate reality itself. Now, I'm going to skip here now to something a little bit, a different approach now rather than metaphysics and scripture. We have a long passage from Shankara in one of his longer commentaries, the one on the Chandogya Upanishad, which wants to describe the human situation, the way it is for all people. And I'll have to comment on a few of these terms. But he goes like this. And this is about how people are naturally in bondage. People are suffering. What is the cause of their suffering? So we have this. When a person, and that could be any one of us, when a person is stolen from existence. Now, the idea that a person has not got the right understanding of things is really not explained very well in Advaita thinking. They basically assert that this natural ignorance where we don't know who we are, this is just something that we have to accept as the case. It's one of the great unanswerables or mysteries. When a person is stolen from existence, existence means a true awareness, which is the real self of the universe, by thieves such as merit and demerit. And what they're talking about here is that a person with the wrong understanding is going to try to interact with the world in such a way in order to acquire things that will make them happy and do things that will make, and avoid things that will make them unhappy. But in doing so, they will acquire merit or demerit in the eyes of God because of the good and evil that they do. And that's going to result in them having to keep coming back to the world over and over again to experience the results of their desires or fears. So you want to get to a state where you're not desiring and you're not fearing at all. You're simply resting in your own joyous nature. But until then, this is what's going on. Okay, he is made to enter into this forest of a body. So this is a very negative view of the body. Constituted of fire, water, and food, full of air, bile, phlegm, blood, fat, bone, marrow, semen, worms, urine, and stool, subject to various types of miseries arising from opposites, like heat, cold, etc. His eyes are bound with the cloth of delusion. And this is really the center of the whole thing. A person is deluded for various reasons. They don't know who they are. They don't know why they're here. They don't know where they're going. They don't even know that they should be on a spiritual path at all. They don't know that the value of the Upanishads. Now, what's going to happen then in the remainder of this is that Shankara is going to use the word I and me or my many times to show that this is the essential problem, this false understanding of who we are. So, and all of the fears and desires that go with it. So, his eyes are bound with the cloth of delusion, he being tied with many thirsts for various kinds of seen and unseen things, like wife, son, friend, animals, kinsmen, etc. So these are all objects of desire. And we tend to absolutize them. Being enmeshed by hundreds and thousands of snares of misery, he goes on shouting frantically, I am his son. These are my friends. I am happy. I am in misery. I am deluded. I am wise. I am virtuous. I have friends. I am born. I am dead. I am emaciated. I am a sinner. My son has died. My wealth is lost. Alas, I am undone. How shall I live? What will be my lot? What relief is there for me? So this is very characteristic of everyday human self-understanding, that our happiness is defined by the way we relate to the world around us. And so the Upanishads, especially Advaita Vedanta, wants to tell us that this the problem starts with our false identification with the body and the mind and all the desires and discontents that go with it. What we need to recognize is that finally, in our essence, we are beyond all desire, we are beyond all fear, and we should be resting in our own joyous nature. Okay? So, that's going to be toward the end here. So one of the things that Advaitins would point out is we need to recognize that this sense of interaction with the world, which is governed by fear and desire, really belongs to only 2 out of 4 possible levels of consciousness. Okay? That would be the middle 2. So what they've done, and this is something that goes way back in the Upanishads, and as far as I know it's been borrowed by Buddhists as well, is there's this distinction between 4 levels of awareness. In the first 3, Sushupti, Swapna, and Jagrita, each of them in its own way tells us something about the ultimate awareness, okay? So normally when we think about consciousness or awareness, we don't even think about deep sleep or dreamless sleep at all. But the reason why it's mentioned here is because when you come out of dreamless sleep, sometimes you feel great happiness and contentment. And the answer to that, the reason for that, according to the Advaitins, is that during the time that you were in deep sleep, your mind was totally inactive. It had merged with the self, the transcendent self or Atman, whose nature is joy. And that's why when you come out of deep sleep, you feel joy, even though you don't have any memory of having done anything. And then the next higher one is Swapna, the dream state, where we take the world around us for being quite real, and our interactions with the world also as being quite real, so that we're not even aware we're in a dream. And then the next one is Jagrita, the normal waking state, which is obviously our state that we're in right now. Now, Jagrita resembles the highest awareness because it is a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of limited self-awareness. It's a confused self-awareness, but it does have some trace of the ultimate awareness within it. It's always mixed with the lower understanding. And then finally, in the state of the highest awareness called Turiya, which is simply called the fourth because it's a state that doesn't have a proper name. We call it enlightenment, or we call it the supreme awareness. But basically, it's the highest state which is characterized by perfect knowledge of your own nature and of the nature of all, this inner unity of things, also characterized by peace and bliss. So a person who attains that goal, if they really know who they are, will not fall back into the old understanding of identifying themselves with the body and the mind. So obviously what you're hearing here is a kind of anthropological dualism. Now, there's a problem with it is that and it is not that at the same time, because we have in Hindu anthropology, okay, we don't have the normal dualism that we hear about in the West of body and soul. We really have three different distinctions. We have, first of all, the gross material body that you see standing here before you right now. And that obviously is easy to locate, right? And we recognize that it is destroyed in death. And then we have what is called the subtle or karmic body. And this is not really something that most Westerners would be aware of, although there have been recent books about the subtle body as it appears in various cultures. But the subtle body is that of ourselves, and I use that word very loosely, ourselves, is that dimension within ourselves which is a composite of a lot of different things. It's the mental life, it's the emotional life, it's the residue of past experiences. But, and this is what it is that goes from body to body and lifetime to lifetime. So the subtle body goes to one gross body after another. It might be an animal body, a human body, or whatever, okay? And so this is beyond redemption. It's beyond redemption. This is not going to be anything that's going to be remaining at the end in that final state of liberation or awareness. In addition to that, there's this third reality, which is the truth about ourselves, which is called the Atman. And there's two senses of the word Atman. There's the false understanding or the lower understanding of Atman or self, which is seen somehow falsely by us to involve our body and our mind in all of our emotions and our relations. That's the kind of self we need to get beyond. So it's kind of a projection or a false understanding. So we could leave that aside and say what really is the third dimension is the innermost self, or the pratyag atman, the presence of either the presence of the divine within or a reflection of the divine within. The 10 different schools of Vedanta are always warring with each other as to the proper understanding not only of the relation of the world to its source, but also the proper nature of the soul or of the self in its relation to the ultimate reality. In any case, the light of the inner self illumines all our ways of knowing, but is itself never an object of knowledge. So the understanding here is that whatever level of awareness we are at, whatever light or knowledge that we discern, it comes from the higher self, the Atman, which is always present in all that we do. And the goal then is to recognize the true nature of the self that it is beyond all of the activities that we normally associate with being a human being. And therefore, it is not involved with any kind of desiring or fearing. It simply is what it is. It's in its own joyous, serene nature with perfect self-possession in its consciousness. Very sloppy language, I think. When we use the word jiva, there's another word here that has a little bit to do also with consciousness in a very limited sense. The word jiva, David asked me to reflect on the relation of jiva to Ishwar, the Lord, and I don't think I even got to that last part, but here's a little bit about jiva here. The jiva, in many ways, is understandable only in light of the subtle body. So much of it is involved here. It's not a simple reality like the Atman is a simple reality. It is a conglomerate of the Atman, of the gross body that disintegrates at death, the subtle body that reincarnates, and then all these other things that are listed here that have to do with the mind. All these together comprise the suffering and enjoying embodied soul. So the integration of all the jiva's faculties is made possible by the self-luminous and quiescent Atman. Since the jiva is essentially Atman, liberation is nothing more than the cessation of ignorance, the removal of false notions about oneself. So the goal then is to recognize that you are in fact the eternally changeless reality, that you really have nothing to do, except in an unfortunate way, with being part of a body and mind. Now there's another way of going about this, which is less dualistic, and this is where I would be a little bit undereducated, but there have been people in recent decades, one of them a well-known Jesuit living in India named Richard de Smet, who tries to find a more integrative way of looking at Hindu anthropology from the Advaita perspective, where we don't end up simply devaluing the different dimensions of what it means to be a human being, but all of that is somehow going to be integrated, but always under the recognition that we have to find ourselves rooted in the presence of the divine to properly understand who we are. So we don't just devalue all the different dimensions of the human being. Okay. Now, I'm not really sure where I should go next, to tell you the truth, because these are all jumbled up here. Hold on just a second here. Okay, now this is a statement by Shankara again, who's the great spokesperson of Advaita Vedanta on liberated awareness, because that's really what this is finally going to be about for our conference. With self-realization, self-identification with the body ceases. So there's your dualism again. One realizes the deathless state. Sin is ineffective. One passes beyond earthly happiness and sorrow. All questions are put to rest by the fullest conviction of the self. Liberation is, in short, the realization that I am the self, which is one, and is characterized as consciousness and freedom from all sorrow. Okay? So this is rooted in the understanding that the ultimate reality is, as David pointed out in his book, is being, consciousness, and bliss. And that presence within is our true nature. And so we need to have that experience and that awareness of who we really are, as opposed to our everyday awareness of something which fears and desires. So I've said that a number of times. Now, the normal way that a person would attain this higher awareness of freedom is, in the Advaita tradition, is that they would have to study the Upanishads. And I mentioned already that if you don't grasp the Mahavákyas right away, then you have to submit to some very, very extensive and long-lasting or long-term exegesis of these texts. So, and so the only way to really come to the proper understanding of who you are is a proper understanding of the scriptures, which tell us who we are. They announce who we are. They don't necessarily explain it in any kind of systematic way. But so the proper approach then would be to look at these passages that announce who we are and come to the proper understanding with the help of a teacher. But other things are also required of us, in addition to simply studying Scripture. The teacher will first of all announce to us the truth of Scripture. If we don't get it, the teacher will help us to reason out the truth of Scripture versus other competing understandings of the nature of reality. And finally, there's a certain kind of meditation that's required as well. Now, Shankara himself, who is the great logician, I think, of Hinduism, we think about how he will take the opponent's point of view who object to him, and he will reshape their objection against him in a way which is more reasonable than even they have done. And after doing that, then he will destroy their objection anyway. He's known for that. Shankara, this man with this great capacity for reasoning, he says in one of his passages, what kind of mind is required for this proper awareness of who I am to emerge? Okay? And he said, it is not a mind with much learning, although Shankara has much learning. It is not a mind which has to be of high intelligence. He says the mind that is required for enlightenment is a mind which is in Sanskrit, it's called balya, B-A-L-Y-A. And that word is childlike. It has to be a childlike mind that finally will grasp the truth. Okay? So a lot is said about Shankara in terms of his own characteristics. Another thing Shankara repeatedly emphasizes in his commentaries about what is required for liberation is that there has to be a deep purification of mind through the exercise of moral activity. And one of them especially is compassion. This does not take you to the goal, but it helps to clear away obstacles to proper understanding. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do, I don't know if I have, how long have I been talking now? How long have I been rambling, I guess I should say? Huh?
About 35 minutes.
I've been talking 30? No.
Yeah.
Have I really? Oh, okay, I'll bring it up. I was going to say I've been talking only 15 minutes. How am I going to get to 25 minutes now? Okay. I guess I get excited about this stuff and I lose my sense of time. Let me finish up by mentioning this person here, Ramana Maharshi. You know, Shankara is not attractive to a lot of people interested in Hinduism precisely because he's an exegete and because his language is sometimes very, very difficult to follow. He's, of course, the big hero for the Advaitins. But then in the 20th century, along comes a man named Ramana Maharshi, who was looked upon as a modern Advaitin, who did not undergo any of the training of the non-dualistic tradition of Advaita Vedanta. He spontaneously awakened to the true nature of who he was at the age of 16. You can read about it in various accounts. And it's interesting that a man without any training in the Upanishads, who never had a teacher to guide him, ends up talking about his true nature in exactly the same way as does Shankara and the Advaita tradition. So he's much more accessible through his dialogues with people who come to visit him in his ashram. So this is a picture of him here. And unlike Shankara, here's a couple of differences, and then I'll just kind of wrap it up here. Unlike Shankara, Ramana Maharshi's spiritual method had nothing to do with Scripture and the proper understanding of Scripture. His method was self-inquiry. Follow the first singular pronoun I to its source. The true self is that out of which the sense of the personal I arises and into which it will have to disappear. So think back to that long passage from Shankara about the person who's frantically trying to find happiness, but they're using the word I for things that, or for themselves without reference to the ultimate I within, the ultimate self. So Shankara says, so Ramana Maharshi says this. He says, if you take the word I that is always in your mind and you trace it back to what it really refers to, more and more different references will fall away, and finally you will arrive at the primary understanding of the I, which is the true self, which is the pure Atman within. He says, but most people turn back out of fear because we're so attached to our normal everyday understanding of who we are. But if we follow the I back to its source, which is what he did at 16 spontaneously, then the truth about ourselves will shine forth, the truth that we are the changeless, deathless spirit beyond all desire and fear. So that's the next one. I am the deathless spirit. So the last point, non-dual awareness, self-realization is the goal. The supreme self is our real nature. There's not a forging of unity, like between a personal God and a human being, or a personal God and a soul. There's a natural unity that simply has to be uncovered. We discover who we already were the whole time. I have to apologize for this rambling presentation, but I hope you got something out of it. And I know David has some questions, I think, or he has a perspective on the value of theism or the bhakti traditions of Hinduism that would also add to what I've said here now. So thanks a lot.
And now, Robert Gemello. Am I doing this correctly? Is there something I'm supposed to say in between, Don? No, that's it. So now, okay, so if Robert Gemello will now take the podium. Thanks.
Okay, if I seem a little downcast and sheepish this morning, it's because I feel the weight of the full Buddhist tradition on my shoulders, and I don't feel up to carrying that weight. I'm very grateful to Brad's agreement to join in this morning's discussions, but I very much regret Trent Pomplin's absence. He and I had colluded before the conference. We were together to confine our comments to Buddhism, and he was to say things drawn from the Indo-Tibetan tradition, and I was to follow up on that with things related to that tradition that are found mostly in China. So I've had to reconfigure some of my remarks. Let me begin by noting that by venturing into Buddhist discourse in a conference like this, we're entering really quite foreign conceptual territory. Some Buddhist discourse about mind will seem, at first at least, familiar. For example, Buddhism's lengthy debates about self-awareness or the reflexivity of consciousness. But the deeper one probes the Buddhist discussions of this topic, the less familiar the Buddhist concern with it will seem to be. Also, many of the questions Buddhists ask about mind, and many of the terms they employ in asking and answering those questions, differ markedly from the questions and the diction of Western philosophy and theology. One must be prepared for this and not allow oneself to be impatient with Buddhism's failure, so to speak, to address directly our concerns in our language. Of course, I don't mean to suggest, lest I incur the wrath of Paul Griffiths, that Buddhist theory of mind is incommensurable with Western theory. Only that movement between the two realms of discourse and ideas is both an exhilarating and at times a disorienting adventure. One thing especially needs to be said at the outset. David Hart, in his plan for his book, and our participants in this colloquium in their presentations have dealt at some length on the task imposed upon Western philosophers and theologians by the misadventures of modern Western intellectual history, the task of showing that mind cannot be reduced to matter. It is, I think, testimony to the persistent good sense of the Buddhist tradition that it has never found this task to be needful or worth the tribute of extensive discussion. There were materialist traditions in India, and for that matter in China as well, which held that the mind might be reduced to, say, the four principal modes of matter: earth, water, fire, and air. That is, matter's solidity, its mobility, its caloricity, and its expansiveness or distensibility. But those traditions never really took hold, neither in India nor in East Asia. And materialism or physicalism has presented itself as a challenge to Buddhist views of mind, and not very strongly, not very strong challenge, to only very recently. David indicated in his introduction to this colloquium that his chief purpose was not so much to address the place of mind within nature as to disclose the place of nature within mind. Such an agenda, I would suggest, suits the study of Buddhism especially well, and invites, one might even say that it demands, serious consideration of Buddhism's remarkably astute, refined, subtle, and often contending analyses of the mind. I know of no tradition that so privileges the study of mind as does Buddhism. If metaphysics is the West's first philosophy, then perhaps what might be called the first philosophy of Buddhism is gnoseology, a term that I would propose we use to label characteristic Buddhist discourse not only about matters commonly described as epistemological, but also about matters nowadays classified under the more or less metaphysical heading of philosophy of mind, and also matters that fall into the category that we may call, for want of a better word, soteriology, that is, discourse about the path, the disciplines by which awakening is attained and suffering is made to cease. In East Asia, study of mind, the Chinese term is xinxue, literally translated as mind study, is in fact the name often given to Buddhism, sometimes to Buddhism as a whole, sometimes to particular traditions of Buddhism, like Zen, sometimes even to non-Buddhist traditions, for example, Confucian traditions that were judged to have been especially influenced by Buddhism. And one tradition or constellation of traditions to which I'll give special attention, one of the principal schools, so to speak, of Buddhist thought, is called Chittamatra, mind only, or Vijnanavada, the teaching of consciousness, or Vijnaptimatra, the teaching of mental representation only, according to which everything, all that is, consists in one way or another only of mind and its projections. This, Buddhism's conferral of pride of place on consciousness as a topic in discourse, is a result of the traditions having accorded or having been driven by its diagnosis of the human or sentient condition to accord to the mind or consciousness a special status among all things that are, among all of what Buddhists call dharmas, the constituents of reality. Indeed, among the several well-known pithy summations of Buddhism is one that says that the Buddha's teaching consists essentially and entirely of only three instructions: avoid evil, cultivate the good, and purify one's own mind. And that last is regularly regarded as the most important of the three instructions. And in the Buddhist scholastic traditions, the Abhidharma traditions, which compile for analysis detailed lists of all the dharmas, all the basic constituents of reality, of which there are said in one system to be a total of 75, mind, chitta, and mental concomitants, cetasika, number 47, whereas elements other than mind number only 28. But for all the importance Buddhism assigns to the mind and to things mental, the formulation of a coherent theory of mind was never an easy task for Buddhists. Never been an easy task for anyone. Never, one might say, a task fully or definitively accomplished to the satisfaction of all, or even to the satisfaction of most Buddhists. In its efforts to formulate a coherent theory of mind, Buddhism had to struggle to overcome obstacles of its own making, obstacles implicit in its own most deeply held beliefs. One such obstacle, as I'm sure everyone knows, consists in the doctrine of no self, anatman, its corollary doctrine of impermanence, anityata, and its derivative doctrines of interdependence, pratitya samutpada, and the emptiness or insubstantiality of all things, svabhava shunyata. Because this obstacle was never fully or finally overcome, there is a tension discernible throughout Buddhism's history, a tension never really relaxed between the imperative to deny the existence of a stable, enduring, self-constituted personal identity, a perduring and substantive core of personhood, and the equally compelling need to acknowledge and to come better to understand the centrality and foundational character of consciousness, particularly its equally essential but also conflicting roles as both the source of suffering and the enabler of liberation from suffering. At times, one pole of this tension has prevailed over the other, resulting either in something approaching nihilism, what the Buddhist tradition calls annihilationism, or at least something susceptible to interpretation as such. Or at the opposite pole, it may result in a kind of substantialism, what Buddhists sometimes call eternalism, which treats the doctrine of no self as merely provisional rather than final or definitive in its purport. This prompted Buddhists, in their efforts to find a middle path between annihilationism and eternalism, to propose descriptions of mind as a process rather than as a thing or an entity. That is, to depict it as a continuous stream or sequence, santana, of momentary, by which Buddhists mean ultimately instantaneous impulses of consciousness or thought moments. And in this connection, we might pause to remind ourselves that the word chitta, commonly treated as a synonym for vijnana, consciousness, and manas, mentality, the word chitta, usually translated as mind, would better be translated in most contexts as thought or mentation. Now, that's all well and good insofar as the view of consciousness as a stream of mental events seems obedient to the requirements or entailments of the doctrines of no self, impermanence, and emptiness. But there remains the problems of continuity and efficacy. How is it that the sequence of thought moments that constitutes what we call consciousness is not random? How is it that it has a direction, a tenor? And how is it that momentary consciousness events, which constitute the stream, events so utterly evanescent as to be without any measure of duration at all, have causal efficacy, such that particular consciousness moments necessarily have particular effects and are themselves the effects of previous causal consciousness moments? Another obstacle with which the Buddhists had to contend in their efforts to form a coherent theory of mind is a particularly vexing antinomy. Buddhism's conviction, on the one hand, that the mind is inherently, to borrow a term from the Christian tradition and alter it slightly, inherently concupiscent, right? A reservoir of impurity, a slough of affective defilements. The Buddhists call these klesha, defilements like anger, lust, greed, but also, and also a matrix, a breeding ground of conceptual impurities in the form of misconceptions, false views, errors, etc. This stands over and against Buddhism's realization, on the other hand, that if the mind is to be rid of all of its emotional and intellectual contaminants, or to be other than the sum of those contaminants, then it must somehow purify itself, there being no extrinsic agency, no intervening transcendent that can be counted upon to effect the mind's rectification from without. Where then, amidst or beneath the morass of the mind's inherent and inveterate impurities, is there to be found the wherewithal for its self-purification or self-transformation? To put the problem more starkly, is the mind so inherently impure that liberation from suffering and ignorance, the goal of Buddhism, requires its radical reconstitution, the radical reconstitution of the mind, a drastic, perhaps all at once metanoia, what Buddhists call ashraya paravriti, a revolution of the base, whereby consciousness is transformed into something quite different, an altogether other noetic species or genus called wisdom? Or is the corruption of the mind merely an adventitious or accidental, the Sanskrit word agantaka, phenomenon, afflicting or besmirching only, as it were, the surface of the mind, underneath of which is to be found a latent and inviolable luminosity, a deep down congenital and impervious purity which, once uncovered and cultivated, will emerge as full-blown wisdom, and in its emergence will eradicate all the surface impurities of the mind? Or is it the case that the identification of the mind's defilements as merely adventitious is just another way of saying that they are empty, insubstantial, mirage-like, and that they will simply vanish when recognized as such? There are two foci of concern with these questions that I had hoped would be presented to you this morning. One is the topic of self-awareness or reflexive consciousness. That would have been the topic, I think, of Trent Pomplun's talk, right? The other is the topic of the alleged luminosity of the mind. That is, arguments about whether or not there actually is such a thing as the natural clarity of the mind. Of the first issue, the issue of self-awareness or reflective consciousness, I can say only a few words. The terms in Sanskrit, sva samvedana, sva samvitti, self-consciousness, self-awareness, is affirmed by some powerful Buddhist thinkers, including those like Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who are justly credited with the creation of the traditions of Buddhist formal logic and systematic epistemology. But the notion of self-consciousness is adamantly denied or refuted by certain equally powerful or influential Buddhist thinkers, heirs to the tradition that emphasizes the emptiness of all things and forswears all cataphasis, at least all cataphasis apropos of ultimate truth. Proponents of self-awareness insist that any instance of consciousness, any act of cognition, and perhaps in many cases the word cognition fits better than the word consciousness or awareness, any act of cognition entails self-awareness. All acts of cognition incorporate. Some said that they consist essentially in self-awareness. This is true even of elemental forms of consciousness, immediate sensory experience and so forth. So for those who affirm the existence of self-consciousness or reflexive consciousness, they insist that when one, say, sees a patch of blue, even before one identifies or reflects upon or interprets or classifies that visual experience, one is aware that it is oneself who is seeing that patch of blue. Any other visual contact with the external world that does not include self-consciousness is not regarded as genuinely cognitive. It's seen rather as a kind of tropism, the way in which, for example, a flower turns to the sun. And we would never say of a flower's turning to the sun that the flower is conscious of the sun. Opponents of the doctrine of self-consciousness say that the whole notion of consciousness being aware, conscious of itself, is irrational, and they use metaphors like the metaphor of a knife, which they point out cannot cut itself. Right? They refuse to grant to self-consciousness any degree of autonomy, any measure of any measure in which it might be seen to be self-caused. And they resist that notion because if they were to grant to self-consciousness that kind of autonomy, they would be contravening the principle of the emptiness of all things. Proponents of self-consciousness argue that the metaphor of the knife is inappropriate, that self-consciousness is more like a lamp which illuminates itself as it illuminates others. Right? And in the discourse about self-consciousness, particularly in the defense of it, we're told that in some sense, self-consciousness, the self-illuminative capacity of all consciousness or cognition, constitutes something like what in other traditions of Buddhism is called the natural luminosity of the mind. The other topic I wanted to present to you, I do so hesitantly and with some foreboding because it's a complicated topic and I don't want us to get lost in technicalities. But as Buddhism developed later in India and was transported to East Asia, first to China and then to the rest of East Asia, concern developed especially with two contrary, maybe even contradictory views of the nature of the mind. Without going too deeply into the technical jargon, one tradition of Buddhism speaks of a kind of underlying or fundamental consciousness, which supports all of the other modes and modalities of consciousness. This is called alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, which is said to be the stream, the channel in which the stream of consciousness moves, and particularly the channel in which the stream of consciousness moves despite interruptions in the stream of consciousness, like death prior to rebirth, or like the kind of absence of mind that occurs in the higher states of meditation. The assumption is that every deliberate act that a person commits, as it were, plants a seed in the alaya vijnana, in the subliminal stream of consciousness. And that seed persists into the future, and at some point in the future is fructified and results in an effect. This, of course, goes together with the Buddhist doctrine of karma, according to which every deliberate deed has a necessary effect. And alaya vijnana and the notion of seeds that are planted in it and that fructify later is one way of understanding how karmic efficacy is possible. But what is significant for the purposes I have in mind today is that in traditions which emphasize the existence of this subliminal mind, it is regarded as inherently corrupt, perhaps neutral in itself, but full of impurities. It's a kind of, forgive the metaphor, a kind of mind sewer, which carries the effluvia of our previous deeds, right? And in this tradition, the mind can be purified only if some purifying agent is introduced into the impurity of the alaya vijnana. And the Buddhist tradition argues that that purifying agent is most likely the Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha. The impure mind is made pure by the ample hearing, Shrutavasana, the Buddhist equivalent of the theme in Christianity of fides ex auditu, right? The ample hearing of the word of the Buddha. That experience of hearing the word of the Buddha is said to function as a means for cleansing the mind of its impurities. Of course, the question naturally arises. Even my undergraduate students to whom I first present all of this immediately ask the question, well, if the mind of us ordinary human beings is purified by hearing the word of the Buddha, what purified the Buddha's mind before he became a Buddha? Can anyone guess what the answer to that question might be? How was the Buddha's mind purified so that later, hearing his words, our minds could be purified? No guesses? The Buddha heard the word of a previous Buddha, right? And that previous Buddha had himself heard the word of the Buddha before him, right? It's not turtles all the way down, it's Buddhas all the way back, right? But in any case, there has to be an external cleansing agent introduced into the corruption of the mind in order to purify it. This notion of the mind, in terms of mind as fundamentally a storehouse consciousness, a storehouse of impurities, is in strong contrast to an alternative view of the mind that goes under several labels, but one of the most common is Tathagata Garbha, which means the womb or the embryo of a Buddha. Tathagata is another epithet for a Buddha. And in this tradition of Buddhism, it is held that every sentient being contains within him or herself an embryonic, incipient Buddhahood. Right? And that Buddhahood is contained in each and every one of us. That incipient or proleptic Buddhahood is contained within each and every one of us in the form of the natural luminosity of the mind. In this tradition, the achievement of the ultimate goals of Buddhism, purification of the mind, resulting in or consisting in a release from suffering and rebirth, is understood as a cleansing of the surface of the mind. The mind is intrinsically and in and of itself naturally luminous and pure, but it is covered, as I mentioned earlier, by what are called adventitious defilements. And metaphors are often used comparing the mind to a gem, a diamond-like gem, which may be covered by grime and dust, but is so adamantine as to be impenetrable by that grime and dust, so that the task of liberation consists simply in wiping the mind clean so that its natural radiance can shine forth. A great deal of the later history of Mahayana Buddhism, particularly, but not only in East Asia, also in Tibet, and in the later history of Buddhism in India, consisted in the debate, the ongoing, still today ongoing debate between these two conceptions of the mind. The mind as inherently impure, to be purified only by an external agent, versus the mind as inherently pure, what the East Asian tradition calls the Buddha nature of all sentient beings, to be, which allows liberation as simply a natural development of the mind once it's wiped clean. And I think if we're to analyze further than we have time for today, the Buddhist conceptions of the mind, we have to pay very careful attention to this, the tension between these two views of the mind. Which reminds me, and I may be stretching here, of certain issues that arise in Christian theology. As I think about Alaya Vijnana and Tathagata Garbha, I'm reminded, for example, of the debates that were discussed, alluded to yesterday, surrounding Henri de Lubac's thoughts on the relationship between nature and grace. Right? I think I've used all of my allotted time, and hope that I've at least given you a glimpse into, regrettably, the complexity of the Buddhist tradition on the subject of mind. Thank you.
Well, thank you for both of those papers, and admittedly asking, in one session, two scholars basically to sum up all of Vedanta, or at least Advaita, and then all of East Asian Buddhism and its Indian sources. is a perfectly reasonable request, and I don't see what problem one could have with it. Lacking Trent, I also lack the questions I already had prepared to aim at him, because having known him since God was much younger, I already knew many things that we would have to talk about. And plus, I don't have Paul Griffiths here, another expert in more Indian Buddhism than East Asian. So let me just make some remarks around the periphery about, first, Brad. For those of you unfamiliar with Indian religion and philosophy, it's worth pointing out that Adi Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is a school of thought within a much larger and much more, it's complex enough in itself. My own, and this because I'm a Christian, I suppose, of all the schools of Vedanta, Vishishtadvaita is the one to which I feel most immediately drawn, and especially the thought of Ramanuja. And it's interesting that, of course, Ramanuja's attacks on Shankara, I mean, think about the major religion of, if there's a religion of India, Bhakti, and especially Vaishnava Bhakti, but in the schools of thought, the most, Advaita enjoys a certain preeminence as supposedly the most rigorous. But the lines of tension between the two the schools can become quite fierce. I mean, Ramanuja and his disciples, at least, accused Shankara of being secretly a Buddhist, importing Buddhist atheism and nihilism into Indian thought, and failing to grasp a certain ultimacy in bhakti for God and love of God in the achieving of an ultimate knowledge. And this made me think, Brad, you mentioned Rambachan's book, and I very much liked it. I mean, I have to say, I had just been reading the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad Bhashya before reading Rambachan's critique, and so it struck me as fascinating. His reading of Shankara is that the later tradition and the sort of Vedanta we know in this country through, Vivekananda coming to California and bringing that tradition of Ramakrishna devotion with him, is very strict hierarchy of Brahman Nirguna being higher than Brahman Saguna, that creation, if not illusory, is nonetheless in a relation, and therefore Ishvara, as Creator Lord, is sort of a lower and less ultimate truth about God. And using that word Maya, not, I see Rambachan says that often Shankara is using the word Maya in just its proper, or its more general sense, same Indo-European root as Maja, power of creation, but instead understanding it in a very opprobrious sense. And the way in which he defends Shankara's position, though, is that I found fascinating and yet perfectly appropriate to what I'd been reading in the Bhashya for the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, was that he sounds like he's describing a very strong sense of the difference between primary and secondary causality, and even in Thomistic terms, that God has no real relation, and therefore Brahman himself, Brahman itself, Brahman is the creator in a very direct way, without this constituting a pathos or reduction of his nature. This isn't really a question. I mean, I'm just. But if you could, I'd be grateful.
There's a lot that I left out. Rambling as I presented, there's still a lot more. But can you hear? Is this on?
I can't tell from here.
I'll just go here. Is it on?
Okay.
One of the biggest developments that's taken place in the 20th century in regard to Advaita Vedanta is the recognition that what Shankara teaches and what the tradition after him teaches is in many respects very different. It's like the difference between Thomism and Neo-Thomism. who represents the real tamas. And one of the main issues here is whether or not the post-Shankara Advaita tradition has misunderstood Shankara on the nature of the Creator God. Normally, as David was implying here, the Advaita tradition wants to relegate something like a Creator God to the sphere of illusion. And they do that in order to preserve the transcendence of the ultimate reality. They don't want to have the ultimate reality defined in any way by its causation of the world. And Shankara doesn't do that. Shankara seems to actually affirm a real creation. That's the minority view, by the way, of the Advaitins. And one way he's able to do this is by showing that, in fact, Brahman remains unchanged by the emergence of the world. There's not an addition of being to the world. Brahman does not become in any way less because of the emergence of the world. And then there's one more thing that Paul Hucker pointed out, the great scholar that really unveiled to us in the 1950s this a proper reading of Shankara, is that Shankara has a very, very fluid understanding of deity or the divine. Sometimes it sounds like it's a relationless ultimate reality, and sometimes there's an emphasis on God's real activities in the world. And the tradition after Shankara has tended to say, well, when we're talking about God's activities, that's from the lower level of awareness. Shankara doesn't really mean that the ultimate reality does anything at all, like create the world. But I think it could be actually argued this is what Shankara is saying. Shankara, it is also well known, is not concerned with a systematic presentation of the divine or a systematic presentation of ontology. His main focus is on soteriology. What is the best way to get the suffering disciple to awaken to the true self? And so he'll come at different angles on this, depending on the level of awareness of the person who is approaching him. But Shankara never provides us with a systematic ontology of the divine or of the divine's relation to the world. That's what happened after he passed away. And so there's a lot of fluidity here then in recognizing or attributing to Shankara the possibility that the ultimate reality might actually be gracious and a help to us in our search for the ultimate truth about ourselves. And so the way that you could summarize this teaching about effort and grace is that Shankara would, I think, say something like this, is that for the disciples desiring to overcome suffering and come to the true awareness, effort is absolutely required, absolutely essential, but ultimately insufficient to reach the goal. So effort is required to purify our mind, but ultimately Shankara says in at least 4 places in his writings that finally when grace comes, when enlightenment comes, it comes as a gift to those people who have purified their minds and have desired liberation to the exclusion of all other earthly desires. So there is a place here, even in Shankara's writings, which have normally been neglected by his followers, where he talks about grace, that it really is the grace of the supreme reality, because he actually uses the word para-Brahman. That means the supreme Brahman, not the lower Brahman. I don't know if you're following me on this at all, because it's all new terminology. But there's really a good reason to believe that there is a place for divine grace in the teaching of Shankara. Okay. And so you could say then that Shankara actually is a lot closer to the bhakti traditions than his tradition normally would say about him. He probably follows worship of Vishnu.
Yeah, okay. I just ask that for clarification. I see that we're getting near the end, so I want to actually be very terse with Rob. I use all, especially the Buddhist material, opportunistically, and quite often destructively. I just like it, you find texts with such precise examinations of consciousness that can be used in a very useful, polemical way against certain kinds of unreflective Cartesianism. But in the end, it did raise a question. It is interesting. You mentioned Tathagata Garbha tradition. And I was reading a book by someone who, it's a Japanese, I can't remember who the author is. It was a book sent me by, I think, Royal Tyler on a defender of Hongaku Shiso, original enlightenment. And in reading the book, it raised a question that certain students of mine in directed readings have raised before when they're reading certain Chittamatra, broadly speaking, Chittamatra texts. is that in that tradition, this notion of say, a Buddha consciousness, a consciousness that is original, doesn't come remarkably close or look remarkably like the same sort of transcendent God or transcendent mind that you find in all theistic traditions. I mean, I'm asking this is a very simple-minded question because most of us, when we approach this, find it kind of dizzying when you get to these traditions, how Chittamatra or schools of original enlightenment thinking or Tathagata thinking don't strike us as being quite the austere rejection of an enduring or even divine reality in which we participate as we're led to expect. So,
yeah, this is the standard critique of the Tathagata from within the Buddhist tradition, right. That it's a kind of crypto-Vedanta, right? Yeah. But the tradition is fairly adept and clever at fending off those criticisms. When there's a Buddhist scripture regarded as one of the foundations of the Tathagata, the pure luminous mind tradition, called the Srimala Devi Simhanada, the Lion's Roar of Queen Srimala, in which the claim is made that the mind is inherently pure because the mind consists only of instantaneous thought impulses, no one of which lasts long enough to be contaminated, right? Which is a way of allying the postulate of a pure consciousness to the standard view of the mind as characterized by emptiness of self, right? So that this may be unsatisfactory, but the claim will sometimes be made that Tathagata is actually the presence of emptiness in the heart of sentience, right? So, yeah.
So, are there any questions from the room?
Right, I recognize I'm bounded by Western conceptions of linear time. But if it's Buddha's all the way back, is there a primordial Buddha? Or does the line eventually wrap itself all the way round into something that goes beyond linear time and that we should not concern ourselves with?
The term the Buddhists use is an-adikaliko, right? Beginningless time. So that's not exactly circular time, it's beginningless time. As strange as that may seem to us, the notion of time as having had a beginning is at least as strange to the Buddhist mind, right? Yeah.
I'm sort of half on their side of it, more than half on their side of it. I feel constrained by the conception of linear time. I'd like to be able, as a Western thinker, to move outside of it.
The Buddhists would approve of your identifying that as a constraint, right? Yeah.
Can I respond to that real quick? On the problem of evil, with Shankara, one of the opponents says, well, you know, your theodicy says that God is absolved from blame for inflicting unnecessary pain and suffering on the world because God is doing nothing more than responding to what people are doing, right? So maybe at the beginning, God, in creating a world of unjust suffering, is not responding to something that happened before. Therefore, God is to be blamed at the beginning. And Shankara says, well, actually, no, it's a beginningless creation. So it's the same answer again. It's a beginningless creation.
Okay, we have time for just one more, and ideally a shortish one. Well, maybe there'll be time for both. Go. Just give Monica. We'll start with Monica.
Thank you so much.
Let's just go 5 minutes over. People won't starve. You know?
I'm sorry for keeping everyone from enjoying their lunches. So I'll make my question very short.
The lunch was going to be bad today.
I just found the entire panel and discussion very interesting, and I have no prior knowledge of Buddhism whatsoever. But I was thinking about David's project within the context of your discussion, and I was thinking, could you think or just probe and start wondering what the Buddhist would think about David's project? So it seems like the discussion they always had about consciousness was with some sort of aim of practical and significant meaning for oneself, whether it is purifying your mind or attaining a certain spiritual state. So with that in mind, if you're studying discussion consciousness and you want to argue against certain type, ontological dualisms, should we want more from that kind of project when we speak about consciousness, or not?
Your question is particularly directed at Buddhism, right? Pertaining to Buddhism rather than Vedanta, right? I'm not sure how Buddhists would be inclined to collaborate with David's project. In the contemporary dialogue between Buddhism and Buddhist thought and Christian theology, emphasis has been traditionally on the theme of the emptiness of all things, and efforts have been made to say that there is at least an analogy between the Buddhist espousal of emptiness and the Christian recognition of Christ's kenosis, of his emptying himself. So the consciousness as a topic, and particularly the question of whether the consciousness is inherently pure or inherently corrupt, has not yet entered fully, I think, into the dialogue between Christianity and Buddhism. But it would be a good thing if it were, I think. So I think David's project, if presented to Buddhists, would open new opportunities for dialogue that haven't been exploited yet.
One last question there.
Thanks. Professor Mahavákyas, when I was studying for my comps at Boston College, trying to understand Jivan Mukti, Frank Clooney gave me your work on divine grace in Shankara.
That was a mistake.
I have to say that it changed the way that I read Advaita, and it was a very striking work to me, because the way you really textually show that there's grace and sin and forgiveness in Shankara, it really helped me see the great gratitude with which the man wrote, and the sense of mission that he had, that there is something soteriological here that he thought very important. And trying to wrestle with that, it doesn't fit very well with the usual Western conceptions of pantheism. And I have to say, Frank Clooney never uses pantheism talking about Advaita. He's very careful to say non-dualism. Something that David Burrell argues is that what Shankara was dealing with is something that resonates much more with what Jesus said in the farewell discourse of John, I in you and you in me. And that there's a great and meaningful inherence of who I am in ultimate reality, and not that ultimate reality is something out there that I'm somehow glommed onto. And that this isn't something added onto myself, but the deepest realization of who I really am. And I wondered what you thought of that.
I would just add that I can't say it any better than you just said it right now. It's kind of a cop-out, I know. Yeah, I take a realist approach to ontology and reading Shankara. I'm not really sure that it's what Shankara is doing. I think it is, and I hope that it is. But I don't know. This idea that the person... See, what I want to avoid here is this. And this, I know we're getting late, but one of the problems of a Christian reading of Shankara is that we want to somehow hang on to a lower self that recognizes the true self without the lower self disappearing. But that's not Shankara's language. See? So that's the big challenge to the work that I'm doing. And it's one of the things that's unattractive about Advaita to me, and maybe that's why I've not been dealing with Advaita texts for almost 20 years now. It's because it's not moving in the direction. I'm much more sympathetic to the bhakti movements that David is about with Ramanuja, but people say the problem with Ramanuja, and David might contest this, is that it's not a proper, it doesn't properly preserve the transcendence of the ultimate reality, you know. But I do agree with what you said a moment ago, that ultimately we need to find our true identity is somehow rooted in the divine, right? But that's a very vague thing, and that could be understood in very many different ways. And I think the language of the self is a language which was largely absent from the Christian tradition until modern times, when I think we were influenced by maybe Hinduism. So you have Merton and Beat Griffiths. I'm not sure how much they count. I'm big fans of both of them. But they start to use the language of the self to talk about authentic identity within the divine, that how there's a natural, in the depths of our being, in some inscrutable way, there's a natural presence of the divine to us, in addition to the later unity that must come, a unity of love, in addition to this natural ontological presence of the divine, you know. So this is something that I really cannot begin to sort out. I'll use the word mystery here, you know. But I think that, let me make one, I promise, one final thing. My teacher in India, Richard de Smet, a very famous Jesuit, his teacher was Joseph Maharshi, if you know who that name is. He once said that at the beginning, he said near the end of his life, that he expected to go to India to show the Advaitins how Thomas Aquinas can be used to better understand what they're doing. But he came away, he never gave up Aquinas, but he came away with a greater appreciation than he expected of what Advaita has to teach him. He learned to be more attentive to the natural presence of the divine within, even apart from discourse about love. And so he learned a lot more than he actually ended up giving, is the conclusion that he came to. So I'm kind of in the same situation, want to hang on to my understanding of God of love, but on the other hand, recognizing there's something here that Ramana Maharshi is about, that Shankara is about, that is not about relation, and yet there's some dimension of truth about ourselves which is non-relational in regard to the divine. I'm not really sure what that means exactly, but I feel like there's something here. Kind of vague, I guess.
Well, thanks. Well, and Meister Eckhart would agree with you. We are out of time, and so thanks so much to Robert Jamillo and Brad Malkowski. Special thanks to both, because they had to make last-moment preparations, one adjusting his paper, the other writing it. And so I couldn't be more grateful. Gratitude as well to the John Templeton Foundation for their support of the colloquium, and to everyone for their questions and comments and simply being here. There are 2 more sessions today, the schedule for which is provided in your program. Please come. And now it's time to break for lunch, which is downstairs in this building, and we'll reconvene here at 2 p.m. Thank you.